here today. I'm absolutely delighted that you are here. I'm delighted to have Raquel Salas Rivera with us today. I am Rachel Galvin. I am a poet, translator, scholar. I teach in the English and Comparative Literature departments at the University of Chicago.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, Rachel.
And I was going to say also that this event is part of the new Translation Studies Initiative in the Humanities Division. So we are launching this wonderfully with you being here, which I'm thrilled about. And I want to just say a couple words of thanks to the Comparative Literature Department, to the chair, Mark Payne, and to Ingrid Segor in particular, who expertly organized this event.
And if you guys can just bear with us for, if everyone can just bear with us for 1 minute, we're having some echoing. We'll get started in just a minute. It's fine on Raquel's end. Okay, so I just want to check, Rachel, that you have turned, that you've closed out of YouTube, because that's the only thing that could be echoing. My YouTubes are muted.
Okay, let me check. Aha, yes, that is what occurred.
I'm gonna hide myself. Thank you. Sorry,
it was me. I'm sorry.
All good.
I just saw someone do this last week in an event. I thought, oh God, and now I've done it. Okay.
Alrighty. If you were hearing the echo, there must have just been something on your end. Thank you all for bearing with us. We're going to get started in just a second. We'll be a lot more kind of focused now.
That was a deeply uncanny experience to hear myself with a 20-second lag. I do not wish this on anybody. All right, so I just wanted to say a few more words of thanks to Ingrid for helping to organize this and making it come together. Ingrid also designed and created our lovely new website, which you can find at translationstudies.uchicago.edu. We're also appreciative of the co-sponsorship of the Center for Latin American Studies today, and Claudia Brittenham and Natalie Arsenault, and their help and support. I also want to thank Jesse Haley in the Creative Writing Program for providing crucial aid, and John Wilkinson, the Director of Creative Writing. This event is also linked to my Hemispheric Studies graduate seminar. So I want to say hello to my students who are out there. I can't see you, but I'm glad you're here, and looking forward to having questions from you. And also hello to Nama Rokem and her students from her graduate seminar. So I am tremendously excited to launch the Translation Studies Initiative with this conversation with poet and translator and editor Raquel Salas Rivera, whose poetry is powerful, provocative, innovative, inspiring. I'm deeply excited about the work that he's doing and thrilled to hear what he has to say today. Raquel is a Puerto Rican poet, translator, and editor who holds a PhD in comparative literature and literary theory from the University of Pennsylvania and resides in Puerto Rico. Named the 2018-2019 Poet Laureate of Philadelphia and winner of the New Voices Award from Puerto Rico's Festival de la Palabra, Raquel has published 5 books of poetry. No Terciario, the tertiary, won the Lambda Literary Award for Transgender Poetry and was longlisted for the 2018 National Book Award. Huge accomplishments. While They Sleep, Under the Bed is Another Country was longlisted for the 2020 PEN America Open Book Award and was a finalist for CLMP's 2020 Firecracker Award. And XXX's, and I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that title correctly, so you can correct me, won the inaugural Ambrogio Prize. And I read online that this year you are co-editing the first anthology of Puerto Rican trans poetry. So that is
correct. La piel de arrecife, the reef's
excellent.
Raquel and Val Arbonais.
Super. And I read that you also have a new book scheduled for publication with Beacon Press in 2020. So congratulations, felicidades. You're very busy. You have a lot going on. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today and to talk to us about your work. Really excited to hear you and to speak with you. So without further ado, welcome. Thank you for being here. And I will turn the floor over to you, Raquel.
Gracias. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to do something I usually don't do. I'm going to actually talk relatively extensively and give a talk on self-translation. Approximately 2 years ago, I made my first attempt at writing down some preliminary notes on self-translation. I was self-translating long before I felt the need to explain my methodology. In part, this was because no one asked me. And in part, it was because I've always had a bit of an anarcho or anarchist response to the imperative that one always explain the poetry or the translation through a set of instructions. Good to know. Seldom have I found instructions useful when it comes to translation, since they usually presuppose a shared cognitive code. But when I finally decided to write down a record of my process, I wrote a short essay which was published on the Mural Arts blog in Philadelphia, The Fetish of the Self-Translator, in which I argued that my translations would always be fetishes, not commandments, and offered a list of fetishes of the self-translator, which I'm going to read now and kind of incorporate into my talk. So the first is, the poem is only a body because someone wrote it. If you cannot touch a part of yourself and feel the poem, it has not been written and cannot be rewritten. Throughout your life, you will be told you are insufficient. Do not believe them. Even if you change, it is not because you were flawed before, it is because you are mid-translation. There are terrible translators. They enter poems without consent. They insist there is a method to love and will tell you it has been written and researched, as they told me. They insist, they correct you in your language, but when asked about theirs, feign neutrality. They are the bookkeepers. Do not ask for their help. Steal the books. They're bookkeepers, but not necessarily librarians. I like librarians. When your word is the same in both languages, let no one convince you that it must be understood. For everything that is withheld by the new language, make sure you are withholding something in return. For everything that is given, give in return. Prepare the area for translation. Create an altar of inalterable objects. My altar just fell the other day, I knocked it over. But I've been recomposing it. Make sure it has shells from wherever you were born, or in my case, wherever you live. An image or an iconoclastic portal, whatever that may be for you. Eat the translation. Dance with it until you are so tired you feel sore and blissed out. Care about the words and the people who wrote them. Have opinions that cut through as feelings, vibes, insistencies. Be rude. In fact, be so rude someone corrects you, then listen. Come back to your rudeness, sure of where you were and where you are. Do not believe in transcendence. Do not believe in perfection. Do not believe in universality. There was no Babel, nor ruins. There is no puzzle. We are not whole in sameness. This is neither art nor profession. You are not, as Rapound suggested, a mechanic, nor is a mechanic, as Rapound suggested, mechanical. This is the part of the poem that survives capitalism, the part that couldn't be beaten down by fear. You are honoring that part in yourself as you honor the poem through translation. These fetishes continue to guide me, even as my understanding of self-translation has deepened and become perhaps a little more specific. Today, I'd like to add some additional observations that have guided me in the last few years, starting with maybe taking a look at the term self-translation. During my undergraduate years at the University of Puerto Rico, in my West Campus, I was lucky enough to find a mentor who got me excited about theory, queer and post-structuralist theories in particular. His name was Christopher Powers. I hope he's watching. And he's still an amazing anarchist from the Midwest who moved to Puerto Rico, learned Spanish, and teaches in a colonial context, while committing himself to decolonial practices. He's never really called decolonial. Sometimes if I speak Spanish too fast, he doesn't understand me, but after so many years teaching in Spanish at the university level, making sure we had texts in a language we could read, and understanding the complex history of our archipelago, Powers, as we lovingly call him, is pretty fluent in his fifth language, our Spanish. During those key years in my early 20s, he mentored me through example as well as through exposure. He was perhaps one of my first models for self-translation, since he dedicated his pedagogical life to translating a body of knowledge he had access to, which was mostly produced in the US, queer studies, transatlantic studies, Black radical thought, that wasn't available in Puerto Rico in a way that would necessarily match our context. Without this important self-translation or translation work, I wouldn't have understood how much of my orthodox Marxist formation was built on a notion of self-sacrifice that was gendered, transphobic, ableist, and would eventually slowly kill me if I hadn't changed. His work also helped me understand that unconscious desires and unexamined drives informed my political work, that my very desire for what I called objectivity was based in a history of objectification rooted in white supremacy, and that I was using the language to avoid my relationship to my gender and sexuality. This is when I started thinking of myself as a queer and and understanding how I moved through the world as a set of performative negotiations. These years were characterized by a growing curiosity about a self I had assumed was solid, formed in ways that were deterministic and easily mappable. Which is why, when years later I was first described as a self-translator, I felt initially uncomfortable with the term. How does one self-translate a self we cannot fully know? I thought of my practice as being strategically useful, but ultimately built on my awareness of not only how different the world I was translating from Puerto Rico was from the world I was translating into, the US and in particular Philadelphia, but also that self-translation was an imperative of empire that often went by the name assimilation. My knowledge of that difference would mean nothing if the world I moved through was oriented towards itself, not its colonies. For this reason, self-translation became a grounds for me to experiment and mess around with multiple questions. What can self-translation give me access to in my own work that poetry can't? How can self-translation be a mode of political intervention in the monolingual heart of empire? How can my theorization of self-translation help decentralize US exceptionalism? How is this a queer practice? Can self-translation serve as a metaphor for migration, displacement, and the colonization of Puerto Rico and all the other places the US has colonized? When should I stop self-translating, and how can the interplay of self-translation and its refusal help me understand the limits of strategy and the necessity of decolonization, not as a way of negotiating with colonialism, but as an ultimate goal for colonized peoples? I usually just ask these questions and jot down notes, ideas, musings about process for myself. But for this presentation, I realized I do have some things I want to say about self-translation, which is exciting because I usually err on not explaining anything and sort of distrustfully staring or playfully redirecting questions. But I realize I think it might be useful to try and describe some of my practices. So here goes. The self in self-translate does not come from an individualism entangled with the history of US poetry and its relationship to the formation of Cold War US nationalism and the championing of an individual voice, poetic voice in particular, but rather from an acknowledgement that in asking these questions about our desires, drives, traumas, and so forth, each of us speaks from our particular embodiments and gets dibs on figuring that out. This line of thought is born of my context as much as my literary and theoretical formations. It is in the process of reading my work to others that I become a self-translator. In fact, I was asked to read in Philadelphia, and the person who asked me was not familiar with my work because my work up to that point had only been in Spanish. And my first practice as a self-translator involved a co-translation with my friend Amy Paith. And it was the first time that I read in public, read my own work in both languages, as now is a common practice for me. And so self-translation becomes an extension of an already all too familiar practice, moving through a world built by the colonizers for the colonizers. Here I'm thinking of Fanon, being from Puerto Rico in the US. I'm sure this is why for such a long time I responded to questions about self-translation with the dismissiveness of the colonized. It felt funny that others found my practice innovative when they themselves invisibilized self-translation that allowed them to move through a world built on a denial of imperialism. How often had I been asked, and more often expected, to self-translate entire worlds, give Cliff Notes versions of Puerto Rican history, explain my gender in a way that could fill out or be monetized. And here were many of the same people, treating what I had been required to do so often and so violently as if it were something exceptional. So it took a while for me to see self-translation as anything but just what we've always done in navigating a world not built for us. A bit more than code switching, self-translation is a colonial mode that through self-consciousness and a sort of reclaiming, I choose when and where I self-translate, not you, cabron, or at least try to decolonize. Kind of the way BDSM helps many heal sexual trauma. I choose when and where, cabron. But the difference being my self-translation and theirs is not just this takeover, but also who I'm self-translating for. Freed of the monolingual imperative through a resetting of the terms, I do more than just force monolingual English speakers in the US to feel uncomfortable with my Spanish. I also become more and more aware of when and where I am a self-translator. I begin to ask myself, do I want to translate this? Am I doing violence to myself in erasing the specificity in translating this, or am I forging a kind of solidarity across oppressions? How do I do that without erasing the specificity of difference? Then self-translation becomes more and more a self-aware practice that denaturalizes my constant negotiations with my own erasure, and a choice to link up with others that are being erased so as to compare notes. La autotraducción en español es una palabra interesante que asocio con la automatización. Autowash a los Fifth Element, no sé si han visto esa película, pero Autowash. Y me remite a los 2 o 3 años que la alcaldía de Mayagüez celebró la Navidad con un nacimiento de animatronics. Jesús hacía como que así, ¿no? Y la Virgen María hacía así. Y para los que no me entiendan, no se preocupen, tampoco los entiendo, ni siquiera los puedo ver por aquí, de hecho. Y por su parte, esto me remite a Mayagüez, un lugar que en mi memoria antecede mis aventuras autotraductoras en la metrópoli imperial. Y que como mi abuelo antaño romantizó, añasco, yo romantizo como espacio creativo y queer Pero a veces me olvido de lo mucho que luché durante esos años, con la depresión, con los pormenores del colonialismo, con mi género. Y esto, claro, me hace pensar que maybe this is what translation is. Well, for a moment, the self-translator remembers the language they are translating in its best incarnation. One could almost say all of translation does some of this. We find the best words to go with the first words, and it's sort of absurd and gorgeous in a way that we want the reader to know just how extraordinary a poem can be. Someone I love claims I'm always selling my Mayagüez to her. So when I explain the history of Puerto Rico de forma photo finish, I leave things out, cosas que son nuestras, que no son para nadie, and not in a nuclear family private sort of way, but in a way that's sort of our mess to figure out. And you won't colonize our conflicts before we even have a chance to work out ourselves kind of way. But it's more than protectionism. I also think the self-translator tries to transmit their doubling. By this, I mean that in translating oneself, one experiences the joy of being one's own reader, of falling in love a bit with the best of oneself. Here I want to break with all the approaches to poetry that see it as craft, something you must suffer through, an internalization of the logics of the production that makes us think of being self-effacing as an ethical stance. And here I'm thinking of C.A. Conrad, who once told me that they realized that they had turned their poetry and their writing into a factory, and that they were replicating the factories that their parents had worked in their own poetic practices, and that's when they began doing their somatic rituals. So really, when we self-translate, we have to find what is lovable about our text to understand it on its own terms. We have to do this before we try to get others to see this. And so even if we don't always know we are doing this, self-translation is a form of self-knowledge, of reading ourselves as if we weren't ourselves, not with objectivity or whatever that is, but in the way one can never be objective when reading César Vallejo or Ángela María Dávila, because one's own pain becomes part of the text as we read it. The realist poets do this. So self-translation just helps us see that when we read, we too are writing the text, and that when we read ourselves, we have the capacity to read ourselves differently, generously, con ternura. My therapist says, I always want to see the best in people. Self-translation is maybe something like this, a practice rooted in the belief that self-love for colonized peoples is already a sort of collective action, that self-translation can be a practice that models self-love as it reaches out towards other colonized peoples, that we must build a politics that looks like what we want the world to be, and that translation cannot be exempt from that. It is not, on the other hand, anti-translation. It isn't an answer to translation. I'm all for consensual translation, right? Maybe it would be easier to think of self-translation as masturbatory. You don't need to masturbate before you've had sex with someone else, but it helps if you do. Masturbation is a source of more than self-knowledge or self-pleasure. It also makes you a better partner. You know what you need, and you better understand what the other person needs. I have had so many people tell me I can't self-translate. I'm just not as good at English, or I'm just not as good at Spanish. I'm like, is this why we write? Is this the only thing that drives us? Proficiency? So I don't dance because I'm not good at dancing? Who cares about being good at it, right? Save that energy and stress for the publication or editorial process. Self-translation can be so many other things like good, so many other things than empire's constant demand that we produce narratives about our own colonization. All day, every day, we self-translate for others. In our heads, as we speak another language, we do it because we have to. We do it well or well enough because someone else wants and needs that labor. But this self-translation, the other kind I'm offering, shouldn't be about being good, but about experiencing something that came from us, our bodies, anew, differently. So I want to keep talking about this and writing about this, but this is as far as I've gotten. And I also want to respect the energy it takes to do this sort of work. Self-translation is powerful, not as in power over, but maybe a different kind of power, a power that runs through, courses through things. And I have a deep respect for that kind of power, the power to remake the world in the image of the colonized, which is to say, let's transition to a more conversational mode with Rachel. Thank you so much for having me. It's very exciting to get to talk about this.
Thank you so much. This is fantastic. You've given me so much to think about. I want to ask you like 13,000 questions and keep listening to you for another couple hours as you talk about this. I'm thinking about, and this is a conversation you and I have had about translation as a decolonial practice, and we're shifting it slightly and thinking about Dami Che, for example, and her translations of Kim Hae-soon, the South Korean feminist poet. But you're talking about self-translation as a decolonial practice, which is a different inflection. And I'm thinking about the extra labor that it takes, right? Is it extra labor? Is it part of the same endeavor? I heard the Zapotec poet Irma Pineda in Mexico City a couple of years ago talk about her translations. She self-translates between Spanish and Zapotec as a simultaneous process. And she said it's like giving birth to twins, that there's this kind of gestational process and the difficult labor of bringing two beings into the world simultaneously that are identical yet different, right? She's also called it a mirroring process, that these poems are mirrors of each other, which might imply more of a kind of exact relationship or equivalence between them than I think what you're getting at in some of your remarks. But I wonder what you would think about that in terms of the labor that goes into it, and whether the poems are ever so intimately connected with each other that they're part of the same piece of art, if that makes sense. I know you said you started by writing in Spanish and translating in English for kind of particular contextual reasons, but now that your process has developed, is it a kind of simultaneous labor?
I think that some things become so large quantitatively that then they become a qualitative change. What do I mean by that? One of the first, I guess, essays I wrote, I guess in academia it would have been an article because I wrote it as a graduate student on translation, was about the poet Juan Ramon Jimenez and Verlaine. You know, Juan Ramon Jimenez's early work was very influenced, if you want to call it that, by the symbolist. But of course, I go in and I say, is this influence or is this translation? Because there's such proximity to Verlaine's work that one could argue, in a way, he's just translating it to his context and into Spanish. And of course, you know, I kind of had like a back and forth with the professor who was a little bit more of a traditionalist in his mode of reading, and everyone was like, "Estás de comparada," you know, like this person's from comparative literature, obviously. It's gonna like be like, what is genre? What is translation? But at the end of the day, I still think that a great deal of what we call influence in poetry is often a mode of translation, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think we have to rethink a lot of how we think of translation as in terms of a relationship to an original, and that presupposes there's such a thing as an original, and that I'm very Derridian, right, and very derivative. You know, I do believe very much in respecting and naming things that came before, but I don't know if that has to be faithful to a notion of originality. And so it's kind of difficult for me, right? Because on the one hand, I'm the type of translator, self-translator, that when asked, oh, are you what comes first, the English or Spanish, is kind of interesting because it's like they're both born at the same time. I tend to respond in a very contrarian way and be like, no, the Spanish came first, you know? And there's a reason for that, right? Because the way I talk about translation, as you can see, is very much rooted in my thinking through and the presence of the colonial relationship. And I just think it's too easy a move to jump into they both happened at the same time, when in fact, my life experience didn't happen that way. There was a temporality, right? There was some kind of temporality happening that wasn't linear, but it certainly involved migration and moving and and displacement and feeling like I didn't have a choice and I had to go to the U.S. and I had to speak English, and feeling very resentful about that. And so I didn't want to make it seem like it's all good, everything's fine, you know, whatever language I speak, I didn't want to fall into these kind of tropes about like, you know, language not having any kind of, like to be decontextualized and universal, right? Like as a good in and of itself, translation as a good in and of itself. I didn't want to fall into that. And so I'm very insistent that the Spanish comes first. But of course, you know, one could complicate that and one could say, did the Spanish come first? You moved to Puerto Rico when you were 14, you were a fluent English speaker. A lot of your work in Spanish is informed by the things you were reading, which were also poets in English, which was also Amir Baraka, which was also, you know, a series of poets in English, which was also Jack Spicer, right? So I don't, you know, I'm at the end of the day, I do believe that sort of like in a purist way, sifting out what began where becomes impossible. But that doesn't mean that order is totally irrelevant. It just doesn't mean that that's the end of a conversation. I feel it should be the beginning of a conversation, if that makes sense. Where something started for me is important, but it's not the only conversation I want to have about translation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It makes a lot of sense, and it connects, I think, to some of the things you said in your remarks about, I think you put it, how can you self-translate if you don't know yourself, and if yourself is multiple, and right, that these things are, that this is a process, and that the self is decentered and not localized and condensed in one place, right? Subjectivities are not that simple. I think of a line from an early poem by our mutual friend Uraywan Noel, where he says, I am a composite of elsewheres, right? That I am always a composite of elsewhere than I actually am. Which,
you know the Spanish for that? Because he always has like a little bit of difference in the Spanish.
Yeah, which is a question I want to ask you too. No, I don't have it on me now.
So fun. He has more fun than I do. I say that he's like the gay uncle I never had, you know? It's like
he's like the what?
The gay uncle I never had. He loves puns. I feel like
he does.
Video that always has like a joke ready, you know. He's gonna.
I think that's why I like it. I'm a sucker for dad puns. It's like I'm a terrible.
I like it too. I can't help it. It's like inevitable. Yeah. I shake my head, but I laugh. You know.
Well, so I wanted to ask you, you know, in the performance you just did, there was a moment of untranslatability, right? Like you kind of performed that switching languages, which I really appreciated. And in your poems, I mean, I've looked very closely at lo terciario, the tertiary, and the kind of differences and similarities between them. And the neologisms that you create, which are not exactly puns, but you know, sometimes a portmanteau or some kind of combination of lexemes that are suggestive in those kinds of potentially humorous ways or affective ways. And they're different between the English and the Spanish. And I read an interview that you gave to Waxwing magazine online, where you called those untranslated words knots, K-N-O-T-S, which I realized, like in saying it, it sounds like a refusal to translate, right? It's a knot. But could you talk a little bit about that, about your desire to leave things untranslated, to create differences between them, and what that work is doing for you?
I was asked this the other day for a class that I sort of was a guest speaker for, and And I went off on this tangent, as I usually do, because I tend to, I feel like Powers influenced me very much in his kind of deconstructivist readings, like when Derrida starts talking about his cat. And like I feel like I can't unsee that and integrate it into my practice. So I went off on this whole aside about maybe it was just because I had recently gotten these swim trunks, and I realized that a lot of my going back to this notion of knots is very rooted in the how they're pants with the elastic, but then they also have the string. And I've always been like, why? Like, why do you have the string if the elastic is supposed to do that already? Where I'm always very confused by that. And then the worst part is that you put them in the washer and then they form this knot, which is next to impossible to undo, and I'm like, I'm a trans person, but my culture is I'm a dyke culturally. And so I cut my nails, you understand? It's impossible to undo that knot. And so I started thinking about this relationship to this knot. And I said, what is my deal? Why do I hate this knot so much? I mean, I have an ex that would call it spot it, got it. Like when you dislike something in someone else that you have in yourself a little bit, right? I feel like this was my relationship to this knot with the swim trunks, I was like, what's the use, what's the usefulness of this knot, and why is it resisting me? And so I kind of reached the conclusion ultimately that what I disliked about this knot was that it slowed down my productivity in some way, right? It forced me to sort of do something utterly useless for like 10, 15 minutes. And then of course, that makes me think about what is considered useful or what usefulness is, and what difficulty is and who determines that. And so I guess that's where my notion of knots is rooted. I believe there are words, and many people believe this, that are intrinsically entangled with their context. And the minute that you extract them from that context, what are they? You could say all of language is like that, of course. What was it? Bakhtin said something about, or Bakhtin's translator, because I didn't read him in Russian, says something about, words being born in the tongues and the mouths that word them. And I'm clearly paraphrasing, but yeah, I like this idea very much, but I think some words have a density that's even more intense, where it feels like completely violent than to even try to even try to engage with that difficulty in any way that isn't just a transference. And of course, by transference, I'm focusing on the trans and transference, and I don't think transference means intact or untouched or unchanged. But it doesn't, I think the structure, the knotted structure of it remains. It's just its relationship to an outside that changes and therefore changes it.
I love this answer.
I wish my answer could have been less convoluted, but you asked me about a knot,
It was a knot. No. That was beautiful. I love this story.
Coming in, I'm very curious about. Maybe someone can read them.
I will do that now. We've got some great questions coming up. And I just want to say, kind of in response to that too, I'm reminded of in the 1975 Nuyorican poetry anthology, the two Miguels, Miguel Algarín and Pinheiro, say that there's no existing language to express the feelings and the work to be done. So
he's fucking with you. Everybody takes our shit seriously. After these days, is fucking with you. No, but it's true. Yeah, claro, sí, claro, sí.
And I feel like that's what you were getting at in your talk too. Is kind of you need a language to match a new set of experiences, right? Or not necessarily new, but that you're seeking to express that maybe haven't been
new in a way, and then when we talk about them, they become like new, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
I feel very intimidated by who's asking these questions. I'm like, oh shit, I don't know if I can answer that. You probably know more than me.
Well, it's funny because we're so disembodied and we can't see each other. Right? So you don't know who's asking, and So I will try to embody some of these questions. We've got some wonderful ones. I'm going to start with one in Spanish from my student, who is in Puebla right now. Andrea, and I'm going to read it in Spanish and then translate it on the fly into English. So Andrea says, hola Raquel, es un gran gusto escucharte en vivo. Gracias por compartirnos tu trabajo. Me gustaría saber un poco más sobre cómo percibes la relación entre lengua, idioma e identidad y sentido de pertenencia a un lugar o una comunidad. Y cómo incluso en una misma podría existir relaciones de poder entre idiomas.
Ay,
So,
¿qué puedo decir? Estoy dando un talk bajo el marco de la Universidad de Chicago, estando en Santurce, Puerto Rico, y la mayoría lo dije en inglés. Yo creo que eso lo explica mejor que cualquier cosa que podría decir, ¿no? Pero nada, voy a dejar que Rachel lo traduzca y luego trataré de dar una contestación más cabal.
So she says, Andrea says, thank you it's a great pleasure to hear you speak live. Thank you for sharing your work with us. I'd like to know a little bit more about how you perceive the relationship between language, this is complicated, lengua, idioma, between language, tongue, and identity, and the sense of belonging to a place or a community, and how also in oneself, there can be relationships of power between languages.
Sí, es difícil, ¿no? Porque al fin y al cabo el español puertorriqueño no es un español, son muchos dialectos y esos dialectos no están marcados por clase social. Yo tuve que aprenderme un registro más formal del español cuando estudié en la Universidad de Puerto Rico y también en la escuela superior, ¿no? Porque eso era lo que se nos enseñaba. Y mediante la literatura, pues ese es el registro, un registro que sí incluía palabras puertorriqueñas, pero casi como si fuesen artefactos, ¿no? Como artefactos arqueológicos, no como si el escritor fuese un antropólogo. Entonces es un poco complicado en el sentido de que no como el español que hablo, aunque sí incorporo muchísimos elementos de cómo hablo en mi vida diaria, ¿verdad? Termina estando filtrado por todos estos registros y pues aún así ese español tiene una relación colonial con un inglés monolingüe en Estados Unidos y quizás en algunos momentos una relación colonizadora con los otros españoles que incorpora, ¿no? Que son también parte de los dialectos en Puerto Rico. Es decir, como que si yo te hablo normal, no te voy a estar hablando como estoy hablando allí. Como que te voy a hablar así, como que, qué sé yo, y quizás nada más en Puerto Rico me van a entender. Pero pues cuando hablo más formal, pues como que esa es la que hay, no sé cómo más decirlo.
Can I invite you to self-translate your comments for those who do not?
That one I don't know if I'm doing. It's too much. It's too close to the heart. I'm gonna skip that one.
Okay.
That's me being a knot.
There you go.
That's a part of
resistance. Yes. Okay. We have a question from someone named Nathan M, who says, Raquel mentioned bad translators. Are there also bad translations, or is it the person or action that makes them bad?
I think, I very intentionally use bad because I think I have a tendency when a word becomes taboo to me to want to re-signify it. Obviously, I don't think that things are bad or good always, but I do think that there are violences that we call bad. And I also think that, I don't know, I've gotten to a point where I used to, maybe I still do, overanalyze everything everyone said, right? And be like, that's not exactly the word you meant to say. And then at some point I was like, listen, you gotta understand, Raquel, como que tienes que entender, like, maybe that's not exactly what they meant, but that's the word they had right there and then, right? And you have to be able to distinguish when one person's saying bad, what they mean by that in their context may not be exactly what you've associated with your entire life, right? It may not be like this lineage of Catholicism that you're like railing against when you write, right? Maybe they just mean something else, but that's the word they had closest at hand. And so when I use bad translators, I'm really just talking about colonial violence. I'm really just talking about a translation practice that isn't rooted in the belief that people can be their own translators, or that translation only happens in certain spaces where it's then legitimized as translation. Some of the best translators I've come across were in a women's prison in the middle of Philadelphia. There's a federal prison with no windows. And you know, they don't have interpreters there, right? They don't have interpreters amongst the women. They translate each other because there are women there who only speak Spanish. And they were some of the best translators I've ever met. In workshop, we talked about how to translate certain words, and they had a very nuanced understanding of what needed to be translated because they have to translate all the time. And that's how they get what they need. And yeah, so I don't know. I don't know if that answered your question.
Thank you for that. We have a question from somebody named Thomas Chavez, who says, Raquel, we've had a long tradition of self-translation in the Philippines, but it is interesting that there's always a power relationship between the two languages involved. Is this the same for the Latinx experience in los Estados Unidos?
It's complicado. I never had to think of myself in any kind of framework like Latinx until I moved to the US because of Puerto Rico. It's not really an operating term, not because of the X, just because Latino es como algo de allá. And that's fine, that, you know, things have their context. Now that I'm back in Puerto Rico, honestly, I don't really identify as Latinx. I identify as de Puerto Rico, Puertorriqueño, no? Because it doesn't really make sense for this context. But to answer your question, yeah, there's absolutely always a power relationship involved. And I think that's why I try to talk about that, you know, my practice and theorize around it and explicate it, right, and break it down, because I want it to be clear always that what I'm doing it doesn't explain Puerto Rico. It doesn't just make us suddenly understandable, right? What I'm doing is maybe something else. And it's geared towards other colonized peoples who maybe don't speak Spanish, maybe are from the Philippines, right? And that my hope is that through the means of self-translation, there can be points of contact. And a valid critique is that I'm still using an access language to do that. And I think that's a valid critique. But I also am all for using like different tools in the arsenal of decolonization, some of which are the oppressor's tools.
Yep. Which verges on a whole other conversation about the use of imperial languages or languages with imperial legacies, right?
Well, Spanish is a language with an imperial legacy, so.
Well, yeah, exactly, as you said. So I have a question from my colleague, Jen Scapitoni, who says, let's see, this is a three-part.
Hi.
That was so rich and generative. Thank you. I'm thinking of your talk in relation to the work of a dear friend, Nathanael, and the twinning and plurality of selves in terms of gender genre, as well as language dramatized by self-translation. I was interested in the line in which you note that if the word is the same in both languages, you reserve the right to its difference, paraphrasing, and this could pivot toward a refusal of self-sameness.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
that's it's incredible. Yeah. What was the first part? Because there was something I wanted to say to that. Something about there was twinning and.
There's a mention of Nathanael, the twinning and plurality of selves in terms of gender and genre, as well as language.
That's what I wanted to.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for those who don't know, right? Género in Spanish is both gender and genre, and that's always kind of been like a challenge to sort of translate that into English. You know, at one point I tried it by like integrating French, as a kind of like, how am I going to make this work? Kind of making it a little weird. I'm not sure if it worked, but whatever. Yeah, and I always had a professor in the Spanish department at Penn who would start. He loved going up on the board. He was this straight man, but he loved being like, género, pero es género literario, género sexual. And it became like a running joke, like género, pero literario, sexual. But I think we laugh at the things that are familiar to us, right? And with time, that question has remained evergreen for me, right? Especially because I'm trans and I'm a translator, right? So the easiest thing I could possibly do is pun on that, and sometimes I do because it's there and it's obvious and it's interesting, right? But sometimes I also am like, trans as in translation, as in practice or sexuality.
That's great. See, I'm all there for the pun. I'm there.
Yeah, that's that Ura influence. He's a bad influence.
He's with us.
Cool.
He's with us in spirit,
like,
if not.
puns, yeah.
So another student of my graduate seminar, Jack Chelgren, asks, says, thank you so much for this incredible talk. Brief question. People often talk about accurate or faithful translations. Are these words even useful for self-translation or for thinking about or practicing self-translation, in other words?
Well, I mean, I think they would operate if you're thinking of like a monogamous model, couple form model for translation as opposed to like a polyamorous queer model, right? Can you be faithful and can you cheat I guess you could if you're like in a poly formation, but it kind of undoes a little bit of the mystique of cheating, right? And some people really like, what they like is precisely to have like a strict set of rules and then to like sin and then to suffer for it, and they're called Catholics. I'm not super into the faithfulness model of translation. I like thinking of it more like a respect thing, right? Like respecting the history and language you're working with and understanding it as much as you can. And sometimes that's impossible because you're so far from it in terms of your own context. Maybe it's something you shouldn't be translating. And I think that's a legit question, right? I don't think, but I don't think that's a question of faithfulness. I think that's a question of just kind of boundaries and knowing your limitations and just kind of, I feel sometimes the more you know about what you don't know about someone else's context, the more you realize maybe it's not your place. But, right, like, that doesn't mean there aren't incredible translators that have just spent their lives doing the work of understanding another context in order to be able to translate. And, I think that they're like, Chacho, bestia, tú sabes, yo voy a ti, But, personally, I stick to what I know. That's me, but I also didn't set out necessarily to be a translator. I set out to be a poet. And then along the way, I realized translation was already part of my poetic practice. So that's probably why I am where I am.
Yeah, and that makes me think too about this ongoing conversation in translation studies, sort of setting aside, as you so accurately described, this kind of language of monogamy for thinking about translation. And it's a very like heteronormative, patriarchal kind of model that's come down to us. And translators and translation theorists over the past couple of decades have written about setting aside the idea of equivalence, right? This is no longer the key term in translation studies. And some fantastic feminist theorists have shown the kind of inherent masculinism and violence that is often part of the theorization around, as George Steiner famously says in After Babel, like capturing the sense of another language and taking it captive back into your own. I mean, the imagery is kind of horrifying when you dig into it, right? So
I'm like feeling like ancestral trauma.
There's more. That's not even the tip of the iceberg. It's like.
Ay, Dios mío, pero ¿por qué?
But I want to like.
Imagine if as a self-translator I said something like that, you know, like my family would be worried. They'd be like,
Right.
are you okay? Like,
Exactly. But I want to pit that against, you know, the Brazilian writer Haroldo de Campos and his idea of transcreation, which has been so fertile and productive for people working in all kinds of art forms and media, right? Thinking about the creative liberties, we can call them that, but they don't become just liberties that are gained because there was constraint, right? That there's a creative potential to translation in his idea of transcreation. That has to do with the idea of cannibalism in the Brazilian context, right? And sort of devouring other cultural forms in order to create something new. So what happens when you're self-cannibalizing? But that might be kind of a way forward to think past these terms of equivalence and faithfulness, right? To think about creative proliferation as another way to think about it.
yeah, and I think it's really cool when people take things from their context and they kind of remake some of these translation terms, right? Because I've always been of the mind that a lot of the problem with what is talked about as theory, which is really just philosophy for a literature student. But I've always kind of thought that part of the problem, right, is that there's this idea that there's a body of knowledge, right, which is brown, which is black, which is usually in the global south. And then there's thinkers, right, that then go in and interpret that body of knowledge or suffering. And which is the result of that so often is that you have, you know, incredible, you know, thinkers in Puerto Rico quoting Badiou and, you know, quoting, you know, Jack Halberstam, no offense to Jack Halberstam, great thinker, but right, like instead of quoting queer theorists from the Caribbean, you know, or thinking about Glisson or Fanon, right? And that's just people off the top of my head, right? But I think part of the problem is that sort of like mind-body division, which is so racialized. I think it's important that we kind of rethink a lot of that, where we're thinking from and who we're citing as sources for sort of conceptualizing translation. Almost always tends to look north, right? Yeah, so I'm all for kind of rethinking those terms, and part of my self-translation practice is also my self-theorization. You know, feeling free enough to make up terms like knots, right? And honestly, in academic fields where that's not celebrated, to be like, I'm just gonna make up a term. You know, what are you gonna do? You know, you gonna tell me it's not real? You know, it's as real as lines of flight and Deleuze, you know, like, so argue with me about it, you know, and I think that if we don't start doing that, then we'll just end up perpetuating this myth that, you know, theory is something reserved for a specific space in the global north.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is with my students. We were just reading a book that I really admire, Caribbean Poetics by Silvio Torres Sayant, who's a professor at Syracuse, Afro-Dominican thinker, who makes a specific point that the Caribbean has a lot to say about the Caribbean, and that's a point of departure, right? And that's sort of one of the major oversights of the moment that he was writing in the late 90s, but that remains a problem today, perhaps. I have another question. If we can just take like maybe one or two quick more questions and before we wrap up. This one is from my colleague Nama Rokem, who says, thank you for this wonderful talk and conversation. Following up on the exchange about the self and self-translation not being one, this has caught people's attention. That seems to raise interesting questions about whether there is a before in self-translation, or whether the temporality of self-translation is different from how we think about it in relation to translation without the self. So a question about the temporality of self-translation, is there a before to self-translation?
See, this is where it gets tricky, right? Because my instinct, I have two instincts happening right now. One that says, no, of course not, right? Like, as I'm self-translating, I'm thinking also about the poem that is the original, right? And I'm going back to it and I'm changing things, right? And so there isn't this unique, you know, this one directional sort of thing, right? But then, like, right, it gets difficult because then I'm like, a word like Jeva, there's just no way I would have come to that word if I hadn't lived in Puerto Rico for as long as I did and been from here, right, and spoken Spanish. Like, there's just no other way, right? So I don't, right? So I don't want to say that's a before, but it's certainly some kind of precondition, right? Like, it didn't come just out of like, just kind of this like completely horizontal plane where like we're just exchanging words that don't, I don't know if I'm explaining myself. So that other part of me wants to be like, this ends up being like a question about identity formation, right? And like, you know, can we talk about the self and identity if we know the self is so fragmented and so much more complex than we can even describe? Yes, we can, right? And in fact, we have to, and in fact, we do, whether or not we go back and re-examine that and look at it, we do as we operate and move through the world. We use that sense of self, right? So even if it's so much more complex than that, I think there has to be some kind of acknowledgement that in how we live, a sense of self operates, whether or not it's constantly changing and consistent. And so, yeah, I don't want to like answer that in a yes or no way, because I don't think it's a yes or no question, but I do want to point out that the question already comes with that baggage.
That seems right. I mean, if we're talking about the self as I'm just thinking about what you said earlier about the self as already being sort of contingent and composite, then it's never a one-to-one translation from place A to place B, right? Just to mix numbers and letters. But which reminds me, you know, of the line that I mentioned earlier from Ura Ioannuel's book, High Density, that I am a composite of elsewhere. And I've been speaking about that. And I think the poem was written in English, or at least primarily in English. I don't think there was a Spanish version of it. I don't think I have it here on my bookshelf, but
yeah, I don't think Uda would ever give an easy answer to that question. Even if we like know him that well, he'll just like refer to another thinker before he answers that question. You're like, well, but hey, you know.
Right. We can all talk about the ulipo till the cows come home too. Which, you know, reminds me, one other person I sort of want to summon into the conversation is Mónica de la Torre, who's also been working in self-translation recently with her new book, Repetition 19, that came out this spring. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at it or if you've seen other things that she's written about self-translation, but she's also doing like tremendously exciting experimental work between Spanish and English that also talks about the multiplicity of self, right? And that the self is shifting in every moment so that it's never that kind of transmittance, that kind of transference.
She came to give a talk at Penn, and it was really interesting because I remember hearing her read a poem that was very much like a play on well, it was a self-translation, but on sonor, like the oral, right? The sound. And it was interesting because I went up to her afterwards and I was like, can I see what that looks like on the page? Because I was really perplexed on how she got that on the page. And she did like this crazy shit I never would have thought to do. I was like, diablo, que cabrón. You know, she was like, yeah. But I feel like that really impressed me, her like understanding, right, of that page oral sort of translation, right?
Yeah.
it was,
And she switches between languages with a kind of facility, you know, within one poem when she's performing. That's just extraordinary. I mean, you do that, and Uraywan does that as well. But it takes a certain facility. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I just want to respond to, I know that some folks have asked for the names that we've mentioned, and I just wanted to say that I will put them into the chat on the YouTube live so that you can look people up. And I will do that when you're done. You can also feel free to leave further comments in the YouTube chat. But Raquel, thank you so much for speaking with us. Thank you.
Yeah.
This is such a pleasure. Un gustazo. Te agradezco.
It's finalmente como que anochecido. Those are frogs and little tiny frogs.
I can hear that. I was wondering what that was. Those are frogs.
Those are miniature frogs. Yeah.
I thought it was something mechanical here in Chicago. That's what.
Daniel back there.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I think he can't resist to say hello.
He's like a creeper in a corner.
Okay. Yeah, we're still broadcasting. Okay. You didn't realize we're still broadcasting. He says hello. I have you on headphones. Thank you so much for being here with us and giving us this tremendous talk. And you've clearly gotten everybody's wheels turning with all of these rich questions and responses.
Yeah.
This is really fun. Let's do this again. Yeah. Alrighty.
Okay.
And thank you to everyone for being here. Thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be well.